Hi, I'm Warren Moore, and it's time for another episode of Social Distancing Storytime. This is a story from about 3 years ago that I wrote for a charity anthology. This is the anthology. It was called Betrayed, and it was an anthology of stories that were edited by Allison Brennan, the New York Times bestselling author, who also has a novella in here, Betrayed. So do a search for Betrayed and Allison Brennan, and you can find this at your major book dealers. They can order it for you or whatever, and your money will go to work against domestic violence, which is a cause that I think is worth supporting. And so when I was invited to contribute to the anthology, I figured most people in it would probably be writing contemporary stories, that sort of thing. And I decided that I wanted to do it a little bit differently, so this is also the most recent adventure of my Western character, Graham. And this story is called The Birthmark and the Brand. They were called the Badlands, and after a week's ride, Graham understood why. The trappers and traders had made the circuit from Fort Pierre to Fort Laramie and back, and one had told him where the water was, so he and the chestnut gelding had made it at least part of the way out of the territory, and had made it most of the way to Laramie when he saw the Cheyenne tracks. He didn't know if it was a war party, hunters, or scouts, but he didn't have much to trade, so he guided the horse away from the path they had followed. It just seemed like the smarter thing to do, until he got lost. Well, maybe not lost, but he was reminded of a story he had heard about Daniel Boone, who said he had never been lost, but had been a mite bewildered for 3 days. The thought made Graham smile, but there was a grimness to it. He had found the bones of men who had been bewildered a little too long, and who could no longer be puzzled or surprised by anything. He felt as though he had ridden through an endless expanse of scrub when he saw the stream. It flowed south, and he decided to follow it a ways. Where there was water, there would be game, and there might even be a town. A few hours later, he found not a town, but a sod house, dug into the side of the slope Graham knew would rise to the mountains to the west. It seemed like many of the others he had seen during his time on the plains. Settlers would build them and then abandon them when boards or logs became available from the rail towns, or would convert them into shelters for their animals as they grew their homesteads. That didn't seem to have happened here. The sod house didn't look new, but there was no sign of other construction. But neither was it abandoned. A stone chimney emerged from farther up the slope with a wisp of smoke. There was no well, but with the stream only a short distance away, they may never have seen the need to dig one. Graham was skeptical, but after all, the house had apparently been occupied a while, and he always figured people could make their own choices. In any case, it was someone's home, and perhaps a chance to reestablish his bearings and get back on the way to Laramie, or at least to a nearby town, if there was one. He called out, "Hello, the house!" There was no response for a moment, and he was about to speak again when a woman appeared in the doorway, reminding him somehow of a rabbit emerging from a warren. It almost made him smile, but he didn't want to seem impolite, so he waited. "Hello yourself," the woman said, taking a short step into the sunlight. Her dress was simple, not the dark of the Amish or plain people, but cloth worn in with the brown earth that surrounded them. At first, Graham thought a smear of dirt had fallen on her face as well, but then he realized it was a spot on her right cheek, the color of spilled coffee, a birthmark. The woman saw that Graham had seen it, or acted as if she had, turning slightly. "Well," she said, "what do you want?" "Maybe some directions," he said, "and I wouldn't say no to some provisions. Maybe bacon or coffee. I can pay," he added quickly. She looked at him silently for a few seconds, her eyes darting back and forth to the edge of the scrub, near what would have been a yard in other circumstances, but here was simply barren earth. He broke the silence. "I'm Graham." "I don't need to know that," the woman said. Then she sighed. "Light and set then," she said, "but be quick about it." "I'm guessing you don't get too many visitors," Graham said. "At least you don't seem used to them." But the woman had ducked back into the earthen doorway. After a moment, she re-emerged with a small cloth bag. "Here's some coffee," she said, "but we've got no bacon." She looked at him briefly, then turned her head so her right cheek was away from him. "Let me see your money." He gave her 10 half-dimes. He knew it was wild overpayment, and he was no George Crocker, but it might motivate her to talk a little more. "I was riding for Laramie," he said, "but I got turned off the trail." How far are we from the fort? Day and a half's ride, she said. Follow the creek downstream, and it meets the North Platte. Road's there, go upstream. Fort's where it meets the Laramie River. She began to turn back in the house when Graham said, "Ma'am?" "Yes." "Thanks. I hope I wasn't too much bother." "No," she said, "but you might need to light a shuck. My husband will be back before too long. He ain't much for company." "Doesn't seem like you'd have a lot up here. Got neighbors?" "Yes, but they don't come around much." "It must be quiet." Graham had considered saying lonesome, but out here it was more a way of life. The woman didn't respond. Quiet indeed. Later, Graham wouldn't know why he said what he did, but he hadn't seen anyone in more than a week, and sometimes he wondered if he talked to people just to hear voices. So he said, "Ma'am, this really isn't my place to say, but you don't have to twist like that." She stiffened. "Like what?" "Turned away like that." "Oh, well, in for a penny. People have a lot worse marks than that." Her eyes blazed. "What do you know about marks, Mr. Graham?" "Just what I've seen." "And how many of those marks have you seen on married women?" "Very few, I'll bet." "Didn't seem to stop you." She laughed and spat on the ground. Maybe it should have. But she stepped into the full light of the afternoon. The birthmark ran along her high cheekbone. "Since you'll be on your way to Laramie and never back again, let me tell you about what it means to have this," she said. "You grow up in Philadelphia in a good Quaker family. You go to school, learn to read, cipher, play an instrument, dance. But you know no man is going to ask you to dance by choice. You see people look at you and they jerk their eyes away. You hear people, even dirty, shiftless people, talking as you pass by. If they're superstitious fools, you'll see them cross themselves against the mark of Cain. If they're the people you grew up with, you hear them whisper, 'She's a lovely girl, except,' and you know the rest of it. I thought I could hide it by painting my face myself, but even in Philadelphia it gets hot, and the paint would run, and then I felt as though I was a liar on top of everything else. I began to adjust to the idea of being a spinster. But after the panic, and when your family's money is gone, what are you going to do, Mr. Graham? No money, no prospects at home. What do you do?" Graham shook his head, but she didn't seem to notice. "You see an ad in the paper one day. Ranchers want wives, we'll pay passage. And maybe you think that it won't matter if there's a man lonely enough. But it does. And when you get off the train, you see the men turning away, and the ones who just move past you out of hand are bad enough. But the ones who think themselves kind as they cast you aside politely, even worse. I was one of the last 5, and one was a consumptive. There were 3 men left, and I feared that, well, it doesn't matter what I feared. What I got was Nathan Flaherty. I remember thinking my parents would have shuddered at my marrying an Irishman, but there was no other choice. "Come on then," he said, and he sounded disappointed even then, but I went, and we were married. I don't know what became of the other girls. Graham stood there, and not knowing what else to say, said, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you." She laughed without humor. "Oh, I've been hurt by masters, Graham. God marked me for pain, and that's what I've had. I had a hope at first. There might not have been many choices for Nathan, but there were even fewer for me, and I thought we might make something of that together. But we had 2 weeks of riding ahead of us before we got here. But before that was, I guess you'd call it a wedding night, but there was no gentleness and less love. I'd lit a lantern while I changed in the back of the wagon. Flaherty pulled the flap aside and said, 'Put out the light, woman. I don't need to look at you to do this.' And he took me like a bull might take a heifer, and with as much concern. 2 weeks every night. And during the 4th day, he talked of how I should be grateful to him. Many a man would have had no use for one like me, he would say. If you have to be ugly, he would say, you could at least be useful. Ugly is as ugly does, I said, and that was the first time he hit me. The back of his hand across my face made everything flash white. I tasted blood and nearly fell into the fire. He laughed and told me that the next time he'd strike the stain off my face, and it felt like he could have. His hands are as hard as paving stones. 10 more days we traveled. He scorned and struck me by day, and at night she shook her head. I longed for the scorn and the blows. And I know what you're thinking, Mr. Graham. Why did I stay? What fool would stay with a man like that? Why didn't I tell someone? Look around you, Graham. There's nowhere to go. There was nowhere to go from the day that train station vanished from my sight. At last, Graham spoke. But what of your neighbors? Can't they help you? She stared through him to a place beyond physical sight. You've not seen Nathan Flaherty. I told you how hard his hands are. His heart's as hard and he's stronger than most. After we got here, we went into Laramie once, and I saw men, big men, step aside us as we went into the mercantile. Later, I overheard two of them talking. They said Flaherty had argued with a cowhand once, and as the cowhand reached for his gun, Nathan swung, and well, he smashed the man in his ribs. One of the ribs pierced the cowboy's heart, they said, but the cowboy had tried to draw, so they let Nathan go. And after that, people moved aside, and no one spoke. No one speaks to Nathan Flaherty's woman, no matter if they see bruises, and no matter if she has to live in a hole in the ground. Her fists clenched at her sides. They're useless, all of them. I learned that as well. I tried to run once, after that first trip to Laramie. I went on foot and found a cabin downstream about 8 miles, not too far from the river. I asked them to let me stay, but when they realized I was his, they gave me some water that sent me on my way. He found me soon enough and told me he was taking me home. I tried to run, but he rode me down and pulled me up by the hair. A handful of it ripped out, but I struggled, until he told me that our neighbors had told him which way I went, and that's when I gave up. He tied my hands behind my back with a piggin string and had me sit in front of him as we rode back. When we got to the house, he shoved me off the horse. I thought I had broken an elbow. I had no way to catch myself, and I screamed. That's when he laughed, and I know now I'd rather hear him curse me than laugh. He said, she closed her eyes tightly. He said I hadn't learned anything when God marked me, so he'd see if I could wear his mark as well. Graham's jaw tightened. He beat you again. No, she said. He had a running iron in the fire. She turned partly away from him and eased her dress below the collarbone, and there, on the left shoulder blade, he saw the scars, the angles, the top halves he knew of an N and an F. He rubbed in ashes so the mark wouldn't fade. Graham had seen pain and death before, from the States War, from the work of nature and rock falls and weather and floodwaters, from the work of red men and white men and brown. But his gut tightened as revulsion flooded through him. What kind of man does that? He asked, and although he didn't need an answer, she offered one. Nathan Flaherty does that. Now, Mr. Graham, why don't you ride down that creek and up that river to Fort Laramie and forget about the rough-faced Philadelphia girl and get away while you... And she stopped, and the sound of a horse's walk was audible, and she threw herself into the doorway of the sod house like Lazarus hurrying back into the certainty of his tomb as Nathan Flaherty rode into the clearing. The man's a giant, Graham thought, and he knew someone was seeing Flaherty on horseback. But as he swung down from his horse, Graham knew the man was easily 6 inches above his own 6'1", and likely carried 80 pounds more, much of it in his shoulders and arms. He wore a wide-brimmed brown felt hat with a busted crown, the kind he'd seen the occasional Indian wear back in Dakota. The shirt was homespun. Graham knew this man wasn't going to find store-bought clothes anywhere. Flaherty looked down at Graham like a man might look at a possum in his garbage. "Hope you aren't tired," he said. "You were just leaving." And he glanced at the door of the silent sod house. "I was," Graham said neutrally, and stood there. "So get." "I will," Graham said. "But can you answer me a question first?" Flaherty looked at him with mild amusement, as if the possum had bared teeth and hissed at him. "Maybe." "What kind of bastard advertises for a wife if he's just going to beat her like a dog with mange? What kind of mama did you have to turn out like that, Flaherty? I'm guessing Flaherty was her name because you're nothing but a fatherless son of a bitch." "I'll kill you for that," Flaherty said in a tone of voice he might have used to mention that it might rain later in the week. "I'll snap your back and throw it to the hog's-teeth." "Too late," Graham said. "Looks like they've eaten some that went right through them, about 6.5 feet worth." "Big talk from a man with a gun to a man without one," Flaherty said. "Big answer from a wife-beater." Graham paused. "Turn her loose. Give her some traveling money and send her away." "What makes you think I have money?" You haven't spent it on proving up this land, Flaherty. Give her some money. Send her away. Just let her get shut of you. The giant smiled. Nope, can't do that. She's property. Got my brand on her and everything. He paused for a moment. I guess I could feed both of you to the hogs. And I guess I could shoot you down like a mad dog, Graham said, but I don't reckon that'd prove a lot, and I don't think you're enough of a man to waste lead on. I think I'm going to have to break you the way you've broken that woman in there. God beat me to it, Flaherty said. A woman that ugly ought to be happy for any kind of attention. The woman stepped back into the doorway. Get out of here, Graham. Just go. And let this son of a whore follow my back trail? No, ma'am. Graham dropped his gun belt. Come on, big man. I'm about to tear down your playhouse. Flaherty strode into him quickly, trying to get close, but Graham ducked and threw him over his hip. The giant hit the ground on his back, and Graham moved for a kick to the big man's head, but Flaherty rolled aside and scrambled to his feet. You're faster than you look, Graham said. Shame you're facing someone who'll hit you back. Flaherty didn't reply, just edged toward Graham in a half crouch, pawing toward him with his right hand. Graham circled, trying to get into range while avoiding the giant's reach. Flaherty swiped at him, and Graham slipped past the big man's arm and landed a punch to the side of his neck. He felt like he had slapped the side of the horse Flaherty had ridden in and stepped to the big man's left. Flaherty feinted a right and came back with a left with the same speed that had surprised Graham before. Graham was able to get his right arm in the way, but the impact sent a lightning bolt of numbness from his forearm to the shoulder. It half spun him, and while he was out of position, the big man closed and tried for a bear hug. Graham raked a spur down Flaherty's leg and wriggled out as the big man howled. We can do this all day, Graham said. Flaherty dove at his legs, but Graham sidestepped and got a kick into the Irishman's ribs. Flaherty rolled back up, and the two circled each other again. The big man tagged Graham with a left to the crown of his head, and Graham saw the white flash the woman had described as staggered backward a step, 2 steps, and felt his back against the wall of the house. Time to feed the hogs, Flaherty said, and grabbed Graham in another crushing embrace. Graham's left arm was pinned against his body. He tried to box Flaherty's left ear, but his right arm felt heavy, and as he swung it, Flaherty tucked his chin against his chest and shrugged, thwarting the slap. He ground Graham into the side of the house, and the cowboy felt as if he were being crushed by a railroad car. The world began to turn gray, and he was thinking the last thing he would ever know was the reek of the giant's stinking breath when he heard the roar of his pistol as Flaherty's wife shot her husband through the right ear. The dead man's arm spasmed even more tightly, and Graham was sure he felt a rib go, and then the two combatants slid to the ground, Graham sitting, and Flaherty's corpse leaning into him and pinning him to the wall. The brutal grip slackened, and as Graham's head and vision cleared, he smelled blood and gun smoke. He wriggled out from under the dead man, whose widow stood a couple of feet away, Graham smoking pistol at her side. Graham sat in the dirt, aching each time he inhaled and happier than he had ever been to hurt. Yep, definitely a rib. The woman's voice sounded flat and distant. I killed him. Yes, ma'am, and I'm awfully grateful. Shut up, she said, and Graham thought that seemed reasonable, so he just sat there and scooted back from Flaherty's body. After a time, she said again, I killed him. And then she fired into the giant's corpse again and again, stopping only when the revolver was empty. After a click, she dropped the gun on the ground. Graham eased over and picked it up, holding it in his lap. What do I do now? She asked no one in particular. Graham shrugged, though it hurt. I suppose you could go into Laramie and tell them what happened. Once they see, once they see your back, I don't think there will be a problem. I don't think I want to do that, she said. Well, is there any money? Some, she said. He wouldn't let me have it. It's inside. I don't think he'll complain now. Go get it. She disappeared into the house. Graham slowly got to his feet, staggered a few steps, and leaned against the chestnut gelding. After a few minutes, the woman came out with a couple of bags and loaded the wagon. She hitched Flaherty's horse to the wagon and put her bags in the back. Graham spoke. I don't mean to tell you what to do, but do you have enough for a train back east? She nodded. Maybe you should buy a ticket. She looked at him. straight at him, and he thought the birthmark was hardly noticeable. She had been marked in other ways, far more deeply. She had suffered, and she had killed a man, and some of those marks would be visible and others wouldn't. What will I do back there? What you did here, he said. You'll live. Sometimes that's the best you can do, and every time it's enough. She nodded again. I have more than enough for that. After a pause, she said, do you want some of it? No, ma'am. You more than earned it. She walked to the wagon. Graham gingerly got on the chestnut gelding. They headed along the creek, and neither of them spoke. And when they got to the North Platte, she turned east toward Philadelphia, and he turned west toward Fort Laramie. It wasn't until 2 days later that he realized he had never learned her first name. Okay, that was The Birthmark and the Brand from the charity anthology Betrayed, edited by Allison Brennan, and available at fine book retailers near you, or possibly even online, who knows. And again, proceeds from the book go to a really worthy cause. So it's been out a little while, but I bet they'd still be happy to make a donation for you. Okay, that's been this episode of Social Distancing Storytime. I'm Warren Moore, aka Professor Mondo. You can find me on Twitter as Prof Mondo, Profmondo. If you like the story, give me a like, give me a comment, something like that. And we'll do this again soon. Thanks, everyone.